The European Union is facing a challenge never seen before, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine taking place just beyond the eastern border, and the European Union has also need to reallocate their resources. Apart from that, we also have the situation of migration and all the Green Deal that is going on. How will the European Union juggle all these topics, and what will the European Parliament election change? Now, joining us right now is Dr. Catherine Fieschi, political analyst specialized in populist and authoritarian politics and a fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre at EUI in Florence. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Good morning.
So, as we know, we are looking at the last day of the European Parliament election. And do you think that with all these things going on, we can see a significant change in European politics?
I think what we expect to see is probably the success of the sort of far right and radical right parties, more so than we've seen in the past. So that's going to have an impact. But it's also important to probably keep it in proportion and, stress the fact that the consensus center parties will still have a majority. What will change is the possibility of alliances between parties that are more to the right, like Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy or Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, with the center-right and the PPE. So it's that kind of ad hoc alliance that we might see on certain topics, which you mentioned earlier, which might bring some change in the European Union.
All right. And when it comes to the topic of Ukraine, do you think we'll also see a different stance towards the supporting of Ukraine going forward? And do you think this will increase or hurt Ukraine's chances in going into the European Union?
So I think that in terms of support for Ukraine, there's a dividing line between the two groups that hold the kind of radical right and far right parties in the European Union. There's the group that is the ECR, which has been much more pro-Ukraine and anti-Putin. And then there's the group that is the Identity and Democracy, that has people like the Lega, led by Salvini, or Marine Le Pen, which have tendentially been more pro-Putin. So there's a dividing line between them. And we'll have to see how that gets negotiated, whether these groups, will tend to form an alliance between them, which would, probably go against the support for Ukraine, or whether, in fact, that remains a really important dividing line between them. I think it's important to note that one of the things that will affect the stances of some of these parties is what happens in November in the United States. That probably will have more of an impact on where they stand, whether Trump gets reelected or not. I think that's probably, one of the defining factors that we need to take into account. And as for, chances of enlargement and Ukraine joining the European Union, that too is another dividing line, between these groups. So, one of the tendencies we can see here is the fact that, yes, there is agreement on some issues between them, but there is lots of disagreement as well.
Right. And when it comes to this particular election, in the previous election cycle, when it comes to European Parliament election, we usually observe a lower turnout rate in most countries compared to their national elections or their local election. And of course, the people are projecting this year to be relatively similar. But when it comes to recent politics, we've increasingly seen pan-European issues being a talking point within the domestic discussion. Do you think that this phenomenon will contribute to a different sort of turnout rate we're looking at today?
Well, I think the turnout is really the great unknown, and it's very difficult indeed to predict, because on the one hand, the European elections have always been considered sort of second-order elections, and turnout has traditionally been relatively low. On the other hand, we've really seen a change in the way that these elections have been perceived, at least in some member states, and that is because Europe is at such an important junction, right? In in terms of everything that it needs to face in the world, the Russia-Ukraine war, but also climate change. These are the Israel-Gaza conflict. Europe's security is in some respect, very much at stake, and its capacity to play a role in the world. And I think that, voters in member states have clocked the fact that this is not just any other European election. So we may see a slightly higher turnout because we've seen more of a debate around these European issues.
Right, like you said, these are pivotal times when it comes to security, when it comes to environmental issues, and of course the European Union has also been amping up the messaging of how important these issues are and to have a democratic process to have these discussions. So do you think by observing the turnout rate later today, it could be used as a litmus test to see how the people perceive these topics, or are we reading a little bit too much into it?
No, I think, it's, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I think that asking these questions is really important because one of the things that we've noticed, certainly in all of the polling that's been done in the lead up to these elections, is that even voters who are more skeptical about the kind of role they want to see the European Union play, actually very many of them realize the importance of the European Union. I think that there's been a step change, whether voters are entirely conscious of this or not, there has been a step change in terms of how European people feel. In many ways, this may not be the Europe they want or exactly the kind of European Union that they wish for, but they can see that it's important. I think that the European sentiment has evolved, and I think even the anti-European sentiment has evolved, right? We're talking about maybe a different kind of Euroscepticism. And so I think that this is something that we need to pay attention to. The vote needs to be understood as something that is being profoundly changed and has been profoundly changed, even in the way that the European Union has behaved over the last 5 years with COVID vaccines or with the handling of the energy crisis. Even people who are voting for Eurosceptic parties cannot actually be oblivious to the fact that Europe is important in their lives.
All right, that's a very good point that you brought up there. Even like the Euroscepticism have actually evolved and changed throughout the years as observed by their participation to the institution that they might be skeptical about. Can you help us elaborate a little more on this very interesting phenomenon?
So yes, I think it really is interesting. It goes back to what I was saying earlier, that there are, two groups in the European Parliament. A group that, one might call two groups on the right, the far right of the European Parliament, a group that one might call, Europhobic, where really they would want less Europe. They're much more ultra-sovereignist. Groups like Marine Le Pen's Rassemblement National, they no longer really talk about Frexit or leaving the European Union, but nevertheless, they really are pretty anti-European. The other group, the ECR, is a group like where we find the Polish Peace Party, but also where we find Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy. This is a group that actually wants to change Europe from the inside. Now, I may not be a huge fan of how they want to change Europe from the inside, but they've realized that there is something to be done, through these institutions. But I think that what's also interesting is that even the voters who are voting for the more Europhobic parties are actually voters who recognize, by a large majority, for example, that, they would want a European defense. They may not be clear on how to pay for that or how one gets to that, but it does mean that their sovereignism and their nationalism has been a little bit dented, right, by the past few years. So I think that while they may not have a particularly beneficial effect to the European Union, I do think that they are working within new parameters and that some of these parties are having to, or at least will have to, cater to the fact that some of their voters actually recognize the utility of the European Union, even if they're not going to make things easier for European Union institutions.
All right, thank you so much for helping us unpack this very interesting phenomenon. And I think we are living in a very interesting time to be able to witness the evolution of the European Union in its current form. So thank you for shedding light and being with us here on TVP World. Our guests have been Dr. Catherine Fieschi, political analyst specializing in populist and authoritarian politics, a fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre at EUI in Florence. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.